Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a really fascinating and sometimes, let's say, quite fiery conversation.
Yeah, it definitely had its moments.
We've pulled some key excerpts from a meeting between Deborah Francis White, from
Yeah.
The Guilty Feminist, and the hosts of Trigonometry.
So think of this as like your guide through this pretty raw, wide-ranging chat they had.
Exactly, covering some really big hot-button issues in society right now.
Hmm.
Our mission really is to pull out the main insight.
And the sticking points where they really didn't see eye to eye.
Yeah, we'll be looking at, wokeness, gender identity stuff, cancel culture.
And those bigger political and social movements kind of swirling around everything. So yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so maybe start with wokeness, that term itself.
Right. Deborah Francis White, she kicked off by saying she's not anti-woke. She actually sort of questioned the term itself.
Like, what does it even mean anymore? It seems so broad, often misunderstood.
Exactly. And what really jumps out is how that same word woke gets used for almost opposite things, depending on who you ask.
She gave that example, didn't she? About diverse casting in TV.
Yeah, something she supports, sees as just reflecting reality, basically.
But it gets slapped with the woke label, and she really pushed back against the negative reaction to that.
Now, the Trigonometry hosts, they had a very different take.
Okay, so what was their definition?
Well, for them, woke included things like being hyper-focused on using specific language.
Right words, yeah.
Pushing for what they see as maybe excessive inclusivity demands, a big focus on identity politics.
Which, just for clarity, is kind of political action based on shared group identities, like race or gender.
Right. And also censorship and what they called an obsession with victimhood.
So you can immediately see those are really different baskets of things being put under one label.
Totally. And that basic disagreement on what the word means. Well, that's often where these debates start to go off the rails, isn't it?
It feels like a key thing to grasp why these talks get so heated sometimes.
Yeah, it really sets the foundation for everything else they discussed.
Okay, so that difference over woke,
Mm-hmm.
it naturally leads into other areas where they clashed. Gender identity was a big one.
Huge. Frances White talked about her book, 6 Conversations We're Scared to Have, and this chapter on gender nonconformity.
She really stressed it's complex, right? Not simple.
Definitely. Pushing the idea that gender is maybe more like a scale, a spectrum, not just a rigid male-female box.
She also brought in history, didn't she? About non-binary genders in other societies.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. Looking at examples like the Native American Two-Spirit people, it's not just like ancient history trivia.
No, it directly challenges that Western idea that male-female is the only way, the sort of natural default.
Exactly. It gives important context for today's debates, and she pointed out how Western legal systems often force things into that binary. Male, female, full stop.
Which isn't how everyone sees it, or how it's always been seen. But this is where the Trigonometry hosts really jumped in with concerns.
Yeah, they raised some pretty big worries about accepting someone's declared gender identity sort of without question.
What were the specific concerns?
Mainly around protecting specific spaces for women, women's rights, and also the whole issue of medical stuff for kids.
Right, the interventions. And they brought up the gay rights movement too, but maybe not in the way you'd expect.
Well, one of them argued it wasn't really a direct comparison. He pointed out that some gay people actually oppose what he called trans ideology.
Okay, so highlighting that even within the LGBTQ plus community, there isn't always one single view. That adds another layer.
Definitely. And they were uneasy about treatments like puberty blockers for young people.
Questioning if kids can really grasp the long-term implications, make that kind of informed choice.
Now, Frances White, she did acknowledge that, yes, maybe there are cases of malpractice with puberty blockers, bad practice.
But she framed it differently.
Yeah, she saw it more as an issue of, like, proper safeguarding, getting the procedures right.
Rather than saying the whole idea of gender transition itself is wrong.
Exactly. A distinction between potential medical errors and the validity of someone's internal sense of identity.
Then the conversation swung back to indigenous cultures and gender fluidity.
Right, because one of the Trigonometry hosts pushed back, arguing that actually, outside the West, a strict male-female binary is more common globally.
Directly challenging her earlier point.
Yeah, but Frances White had a counter for that. She talked about the impact of colonization.
How Western influence might have stamped out or hidden other ways of understanding gender.
Precisely. She used examples from Australia Aboriginal brother boys and sister girls to show how diverse gender understandings existed before and were often suppressed.
Wow, that's That's a really powerful argument she made there about colonization changing things. It totally reframes it.
It does. And it led to this, well, pretty intense back and forth about Western civilization's historical impact, its gender binaries.
A real clash over whether those Western ideas were always dominant or if they just kind of steamrollered over other traditions.
Makes you think, though, how much our own background shapes how we even hear these arguments, doesn't it?
Sure. And it shows how complex history is. Both sides were pulling on different threads, different interpretations.
Absolutely. You can't easily generalize across so many cultures and times. It's tricky territory.
Okay, let's switch gears. Another really contentious topic they got into, cancel culture.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And the Trigonometry hosts, they were pretty blunt here.
How so?
They linked it back to their definition of wokeism, calling it a cult, strong words, and they expressed real discomfort with cancel culture.
Even comparing it to, what, communist censorship?
Yeah, pretty heavy comparison. They brought up the comedian Joe Lycett, too.
What was his take?
That cancel culture hasn't actually made comedy better, and it really messes with people's ability to make a living.
So focusing on the real-world, tangible harm it can cause.
Mm-hmm. And Frances White, she offered a really interesting personal angle on this.
From her own life?
Yeah, she talked about her experience leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses, the shunning, the ostracization. She saw parallels there with cancel culture, being cut off for not conforming.
That's quite a perspective.
Yeah.
But she also raised another side to it, didn't she?
She did, a really tricky point. What do communities do about people causing harm if the legal system doesn't or can't fully address it?
Bringing in the Me Too movement as an example.
Exactly, acknowledging that sometimes there's this need for accountability outside formal law.
Which then leads to the question of whether cancel culture is the right way to do that. Does it actually make things worse sometimes?
Yeah, they discussed that. Does pushing people out, ostracizing them, actually prevent learning or change? Maybe empathy and community intervention are better?
It's a tough balance. The hosts shared that story, too, about the comedian with autism.
Right, who got canceled, basically, for social awkwardness. It shows how easily it can be misused, when there's no nuance.
And the Alfie Brown case came up, old jokes resurfacing, causing cancellations years later.
Which opens up that whole can of worms about past actions, evolving standards of offense, how long someone is on the hook for something they said.
Where did Frances White land on the comedy aspect?
Well, she defended the right to do edgy comedy, said it's important for the art form, for pushing boundaries, for commentary.
With caveats.
Yeah, but she also stressed the responsibility that comes with having a platform. Words have impact, especially when they play into harmful stereotypes.
So was there any common ground on canceling people?
I think generally, yeah. All three seem to agree that just broadly canceling people is usually a bad idea, not productive.
And they suggested it often happens because there's this gap, right? Between what the law punishes and what people feel is just plain wrong or immoral.
Exactly. Like, people feel it's the only tool they have left to express disapproval or demand some kind of consequence.
Which brings us nicely to the role of social media in driving a lot of this.
Absolutely. Frances White mentioned some research suggesting social media might, maybe, make kids more empathetic in some ways.
Oh, interesting. But there was a but, wasn't there?
A big but. She argued that this empathy often gets demanded for narrower and narrower groups, very specific in-groups.
And the example she used was that men are trash, hashtag.
Yeah. Talking about how divisive that kind of rhetoric can be online, how it might negatively affect young men.
And potentially even be twisted or misinterpreted by men who do harm women, making them feel more alienated, maybe less likely to take responsibility.
It's complex, and the hosts then flipped the script slightly, introducing this idea of vice signaling.
Okay, what's that? Like the opposite of virtue signaling?
Kind of, yeah. It's supposedly more common on the right, deliberately saying offensive or provocative things, maybe not because you fully believe them.
But to signal you reject mainstream norms. Or just to get a reaction.
Exactly. Adds another layer to figuring out what's going on in online arguments.
So this talk about online dynamics, signaling, backlash, it led them into discussing the rise of the right, didn't it? And identity politics.
It did. They debated why femmes like Andrew Tate have gained traction. One host suggested it might be partly a backlash.
A reaction against things like the all men are trash sentiment online.
That was the suggestion. Frances White acknowledged backlash as a factor, sure, but she also pointed to deeper things.
Like what?
Underlying misogyny, for one. And also the deliberate strategies of far-right groups.
She mentioned specific info.
Yeah, from someone named Neil Data about how some far-right organizations apparently focus strategically on issues like trans rights, specifically to sow division among progressives.
Wow. Okay, and then they got into defining the far right itself.
Which is always tricky. They debated whether people like Elon Musk or Donald Trump actually fit that label. Clear disagreements there on interpreting their actions and words.
There seemed to be real concern expressed about rights being rolled back, particularly in the U.S.
Definitely. Worries about LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights. Frances White even made that comparison to Gilead from The Handmaid's Tale.
That really conveys a sense of alarm, a fear of going backwards.
It does. And it led to a side discussion about whether using labels like fascist so often might actually weaken their impact.
Like the words lose their power if they're overused.
Yeah, making it harder to spot the real deal when it appears.
And this all circled back, inevitably, to identity politics.
Right. One of the Triggernometry guys argued that focusing on identity groups is inherently divisive, that it pushes away people who aren't in those specific groups.
That's a pretty common critique, isn't it?
It is. But Frances White pushed back on that too,
Oh.
by arguing that sometimes you have to focus on specific marginalized groups to get equal rights. She used the gay rights movement as the key example that targeted advocacy was essential for progress.
So arguing it's a necessary step towards broader equality, not just division.
Exactly. And that part of the conversation apparently got quite tense. Accusations of misrepresenting each other's points.
Which just shows how high the emotional stakes are in these discussions, doesn't it? When core beliefs and identities feel like they're on the line.
Absolutely. It really highlights the friction.
So, wrapping up this deep dive. Wow. It's clear this conversation really exposed the deep, complex divisions we see around so many social and political issues today.
Yeah, what really stands out is just how hard it is to even agree on the words we use, like woke, or to navigate these incredibly nuanced topics like gender identity.
And it really put a spotlight on cancel culture, its problems, its different facets.
Definitely. And it makes you think, doesn't it, about the power of online talk, the hidden motives maybe shaping politics.
And just how hard it is to find common ground when things feel so polarized.
The passion in their disagreements, it really drives home the need for, well, maybe trying harder to understand different views and the emotions driving them.
Absolutely. So this deep dive, it really leaves us with a final thought for you, listening in. What part of this really hit home for you?
Yeah, were there arguments that made you pause or challenged how you thought about things?
We'd really encourage you to mull over the different perspectives we've touched on here and maybe keep exploring these, well, really vital topics for yourself.